Hi, my name is Boris, and in this video I'm going to talk about one of the most underrated stock Ableton synthesizers, which is called Analog. This synth is so often overlooked because of its rather poor set of presets that come with Ableton, but my goal for today is to convince you that this is a versatile beast. Not only can it produce a wide range of sounds, but also it's got a really amazing character. And it's modeled after several vintage synthesizers, and that gives it an amazing tone. Before we get into the details of Analog, if you like what we are doing on this channel, consider subscribing for more Ableton Live tips like this one. Okay, so here's Analog, and this synth might look a little bit confusing at first because it's got this classic Ableton style layout, so you don't see everything at once, but instead all of the parameters are folded nicely into tabs, which you can access by clicking on different sections of the synth. And if you click on different sections, the center display shows the corresponding parameters. If you are coming from a more visual synth, this might be a disadvantage for you because it's going to make designing patches slightly harder at the beginning. But in fact, I find it really nice to work with because it is really tidy and it fits perfectly into the workflow of Ableton. You don't have any floating windows like with a VST, and another amazing advantage of Analog is that it's really lightweight, so you can stack multiple instances of it, you don't have to freeze and flatten tracks, and you shouldn't overload your CPU. So this video is also going to be a little bit of an introduction to subtractive synthesis. So if you're a beginner at synthesis as a whole, this is also going to work for you. I'm going to just basically explain how basic synthesis works. And if you're new to Analog, I'm also going to go over essential features of the synthesizer. And also I'm going to demonstrate a couple of sounds that I have designed. This cool keys patch. This is pretty simple, just some analog keys with a bunch of effects on top, and then we're going to make this synth wavy sort of bass line. So this is something heavier. As you can hear, Analog sounds really powerful, really big for bass sounds and all sorts of sounds. So let's just get started. Let's quickly go over the basics of subtractive synthesis. So this synth basically consists of three basic parts. First part is an oscillator, which is placed right here, and that controls the timbre and pitch of our sound. Then this section right here called an amplifier or an amp, that controls how loud the sound is. And there's a filter section between the oscillator and the amp right here, but more on that later. First of all, you can disable all the other features of Analog by just clicking and disabling everything. If I have the default patch, I can just disable all other elements but the first oscillator, put it down 1 octave to 0. Let's choose the sine wave first here, because we've got 4 shapes here, and the sine wave is the most basic one. Right now we are going to get no sound. Even if I arm this track and I play on the keyboard, there is absolutely no sound. And that is because the oscillator on its own does not generate sound. We need the amplifier, which controls how loud the sound is going to be. So I'm going to enable this component, and now we should get sound. So that is a basic sine wave. It's not very bright, it's quite subtle and typically fits more in the background than in the foreground if you're gonna use it. Each amplifier section on a subtractive synth is going to have something called an amplifier envelope. An envelope basically, and the envelope controls how loud the sound is over time. So instead of, for example, moving this knob right here, we can have the amplifier envelope doing that for us basically. There are two basic parameters of an envelope that are most frequently used, and that's attack and decay. And both of these parameters you can see right here. So attack basically tells us if we increase attack, the sound is going to come in gradually instead of abruptly. Let's try it. That's no attack, and increasing it. You get the idea. And then decay basically controls how long the sound is going to stay with us. So let's take the attack down all the way, and the decay is now really short as well. But if we increase the decay, you can hear that the sound got much longer. So we can play around with the attack and decay. And we can actually visualize that. I'm going to duplicate, freeze and flatten this track, and I'm going to show you where these parameters are with a blank utility. So this would be our attack, this portion of the sound, and this is our release. So the attack controls how long it's going to take for the sound to reach this level, and then basically this is the release. Okay, so that's it for the attack and decay. And then also there is something called the sustain and the release. And the sustain basically can be used if you would like the sound to be sustained as long as you're holding the note. So let's make the decay shorter. And if we increase the sustain, it's going to sustain the note as long as we are playing the key. We are still getting the attack and decay, but instead of ending up on silence, we are ending up on the sustain level. And the last parameter is the release, and that basically is like a decay at the end when we've stopped pushing the key. So let's increase that. Okay, so let's visualize that once again. So here's what this envelope looks like now. This would be our attack portion. This would be our decay portion. You can see that here the volume decreases. Now we have sustain, so static loudness, and then it's the release time. So once again, this would be our attack, this would be our decay, this would be our sustain level. It's sustained as long as we are pressing the key, and then we've got the release after we've stopped pushing the key. And we've got a really cool infographic. You can see that the attack is the time we are taking from 0 to the max amplitude. Then there's the decay, and then we're reaching the sustain level, and there's the release. And this infographic is available in a much better resolution as a link in the description. It's a free download, so make sure you guys get that.
Just a quick break before we go back to the tutorial. If you find these type of videos helpful, we can highly recommend the PML Academy with over 35 full-length online courses, spreading over topics like writing chords and melodies or arranging your songs to producing entire songs from start to finish. So check out the link in the description to see what's inside the All Courses bundle exactly.
Let's make this patch more interesting. To do that, we're going to switch from this boring sine wave to a saw wave. And the saw wave is much brighter, and it is going to not be too pleasant right now, but let's turn down the volume and hear what it sounds like. Yeah, so it's really, really bright. And the same goes for the square wave. Then there's white noise, which is not really melodic. But for now, let's stick to the saw wave. With the saw wave and the square wave, it's really crucial to use the filter, the module between the oscillator and the amplifier. So if we turn that on, you'll immediately hear what the difference is. So right now you can hear that the frequencies are a bit limited. It's a bit muffled, much more like the sine wave we've used at the beginning. But if we use this frequency knob here, we can change the timbre. And the majority of magic in synthesizers comes from this knob, this frequency knob. If you have a MIDI controller, you should have some automatic mappings in Ableton, and the first control should be this frequency knob. So the filter basically attenuates some of the frequencies. There are different kinds of filters, and the typical use is with a low pass filter. So we are attenuating the high frequencies and leaving the low frequencies. But there's also a possibility that you're going to be using a high pass filter, but that's just going to remove the low frequencies and leave the very bright high frequencies. Okay, so let's leave that as it is. Just like with the amplifier, we can use a filter envelope to make our sound more interesting. And the filter envelope, just like the amplifier envelope, moves a knob for us, and the knob is this frequency knob. So if we add, for example, let's lower the sustain, lower the frequency as well, and we are going to add a little bit of that envelope. So you can hear that the frequency knob opens up at the beginning and then quickly closes. If we increase the decay, that's suddenly much slower. And the amount of our envelope is controlled with this env control over here, and you can just drag this up and down. And this resonance control changes the timbre a little bit. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a brass sound going on. Maybe we can also enable polyphony, so being able to play multiple voices. For that, you can go to the last tab, and from voices, you can choose the maximum amount, for example. And now we should be able to play multiple voices. Okay, so this is really cheesy, but this really nicely demonstrates how the filter frequency has a similar behavior as the amplifier envelope. Let's go down a few octaves here. And now there's a really cool option which is called a filter drive. And that basically is accessed from here. And you can choose different filter drive modes. And this basically simulates the behavior of analog synthesizers, where the filter would actually add a bit of color to our oscillator. To use that, you can just choose the mode. The lower you go, basically here, the brighter the sound is going to become, the more distorted. And to add drive, basically you need to push the volume of the oscillator going into the filter. Let's go even brighter. Right, so this would be our maximum drive here. You can hear that that's a pretty big difference. So you can also mess around with that to give your sound a little bit more power, even before it goes out of the synthesizer. The filter is where you spend 50% of your time designing patches. This is really crucial to get that right. Choosing the right frequency cutoff position as well as the right envelope settings is like half of the job. But then the other half of sound design happens after you've designed the source of your sound, and it happens with audio effects. So for example, we can put, I don't know, a reverb on here, and this is already going to sound much cooler. And another really commonly used audio effect would be the chorus, which makes a sound much wider. This is the chorus from earlier versions of Ableton, but you can use chorus ensemble effect from Live 11. Let's remove these effects and let's go through some other crucial parameters in analog, because the oscillator, filter and amplifier is not all that analog has to offer. So obviously you've got another set of oscillator, filter and amp at the bottom, and you can choose different routings here. So the second oscillator, for example, can go into the first filter, or the first oscillator can go into the second filter, and so on. This basically can be controlled by these controls over here. So this now goes to filter 1, this now goes to filter 2. And the quick routings are a really cool option because you can quickly choose the routings here. So you can see oscillator is O, filter is F, amp is A, and this is really visual and a really quick way to do your routings. So these are the routings. Something else that's really useful would be the LFO. Disable this envelope on the filter, and we can assign the LFO to also move the frequency knob here. So LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and it basically is a bit of a sine wave or a different shape here that you can assign to some parameters like the frequency cutoff on the filter, and it basically moves it a regular way. This is done in a continuous manner, not just like the envelope, which just happens once. Another feature is the vibrato, which you can assign to the pitch of your sound. So you can increase it here. So this also is really used if you're emulating different acoustic instruments, because these often have a bit of vibrato going on, like guitars and so on. That's pretty much it. You can add a bit of wobble. Then there's this unison, which is really crucial if you're going to be stacking multiple voices, so making bigger sounding sounds. If you enable unison, you need to increase this detune knob here. So before, after. And this basically like duplicates your oscillator and detunes these a little bit so that it makes the sound. So it's like two people singing together, and it just makes the sound much bigger. And then you can also increase the voices amount to, for example, 4. Yeah, so this makes it much bigger. And also you can add another oscillator, and that adds another 4 voices. And now we've gone from a basic patch to something that sounds really powerful. Then you've got glide, which basically adds the gliding effect. So you can glide between notes if you overlap them on your keyboard. And another cool feature is that if you access the oscillator tab, you've got these controls right here, which change the oscillator at its core. So for example, it's really crucial with the square wave, because by default, the pulse width modulation is applied. It's at 50% by default, and the most common square wave state would be at 100%. And then if we go down, it changes the timbre. So at 0, it's really tiny, a little bit squashed. But at 100%, it's the default state. And if we go here into the saw wave, there's only this sub and sync section available. And the sub basically adds an octave below the oscillator. And the sync also really modifies the timbre, adds a lot of high frequencies. But this gets really noisy quickly. And also there is this noise section, which just generates white noise, and this is really useful if you've already used up 2 oscillators and you want to boost the sound even more by adding some noise. And this adds that really nice analog warm white noise that basically fills up space and makes patches sound much fuller. Okay, so if we've got the basics of synthesis in analog covered, then it's probably time to take a look at some of the presets here, maybe go over how to make keys patches and bass patches. So very basic sounds here. So first of all, let's take a look at this patch. And it's quite a dynamic patch. The filter responds to the velocity of the keys. And that's a really nice feature of analog as well, and it can be accessed from right here. But let's dissect this preset a little bit more. So we have a saw wave oscillator with a really long amp envelope, like 9 seconds of decay or 3 or 4, almost 4 seconds of release. Then we are applying a filter, so at 300 Hertz there's the filter cutoff, so really low, and we are applying quite a bit of the filter envelope. So without and with. So we have quite a long decay and release as well, but not as long as in the amplifier section. We've got a bit of drive going on here as well. The first, so sort of soft drive, and then we're driving it with the oscillator, and that's how this is created. Then we've applied the envelope to respond to the velocity. And this works really nice if you're playing a MIDI keyboard, because then it gives the patch a more live feel. And the same can be actually applied here to the amplifier section. Is actually applied to 4. So not only does the filter cutoff respond to the velocity, but also the amp level as well. There's no LFO, no Unison, and this sound is mono by now. But we are applying chorus. And chorus is one of the most commonly used effects with analog synthesizers, because analog synths are typically mono, and then with chorus we are really spreading the voices, adding a delay. We're adding a bunch of voices to make it much wider and much more lush. After the chorus, we've got drum bass, which drives our sound. And without it, so the drum bass not only boosts the volume, but also adds a bit of drive. Okay, so the next one is echo, and this adds a slight bit of delay, so 8 notes. And echo is really nice, really warm, and it's a great pairing with the analog synthesizer, because it's really warm sounding. Very basic 8 notes with not too much dry wet. And then we are applying a bit of reverb with all the parameters disabled, high quality, and a bit of chorus as well, a little over 1 second of decay time. So it's not too much reverb, but just enough to put it in a space. And then I'm adding just an EQ to clean up the low end. If you're wondering how I'm quickly folding and unfolding these effects, I am simply pressing plus or minus on the computer keyboard, and this allows you to quickly see an overview of which effects you have applied. Most patches nowadays are going to use a bunch of effects, not only 1 or 2. So to keep it nice and tidy, you can just fold them not only by double clicking, but also by pressing plus and minus. These would be our keys. And now let's take a look at the bass. We can even mess around with the frequency. This is a little bit more complex, but not too much. Let's quickly fold the audio effects. Okay, so let's take a look at analog at the beginning. I'm going to disable the filter, disable the second oscillator, and I'm also going to disable the arpeggiator MIDI effect. So as you can see, we've got no release here. But we've got this linear mode here in the amplifier section instead of exponential. So that basically means that the sound basically goes down in volume in a linear way instead of just much more quickly in the exponential mode. And we've got sustain all the way down. Decay is set to around 600 milliseconds. The most important characteristic comes from the filter. Maybe we can also disable this Unison. Right, so basically we are really low, almost all the way down with the frequency here. We have drive enabled, but we're not really driving the filter much with the gain. And we have a lot of envelope applied and the same decay as in the amplifier section. And we are also in linear mode. So this is what would sound like in exponential mode. This is a little bit slower, basically. Yeah, so we have Unison applied. with 4 voices, and that basically makes it so that basically multiplies our voices by 4, and so this voice basically multiplies our oscillator by 4 and detunes the voices. And then I am doing the same thing with Oscillator 2, so I'm duplicating the voices even more. We're playing 4 voices here. Actually, if I disable the effects, you will hear what it sounds like. This is not too punchy, not too powerful. First of all, we are doing a bit of chorus, just to like 30% to give it a little bit of stereo spread. But then the most power actually comes from the drum bass audio effect. So we are adding a lot of drive and crunch. This mode of distortion is really nice. I really love using the drum bass for saturation. And then we are using the echo for a little bit of a delay, but just 12% of dry wet. And then we are just adding a splash of reverb to just put it in a space as well, with a bit of a longer decay time, but you don't need to use that long to have that sort of Outrun synthwave sequencing style arpeggiator. I've applied the arpeggiator before the analog as a MIDI effect. It's basically, you can find it, you will find it in MIDI effects at the top, and I'm doing 8th notes with the gate all the way up, and this is what it sounds like. So as you can see and hear, analog sounds really powerful when paired with a bunch of audio effects and when you're really utilizing all of the functions that it has to offer. It's really simple, but for patches that are not really crazy, this is an amazing solution because it's really lightweight. If I play this patch without the audio effects, you can see that I'm only having like 5% of my CPU power taken. So that's not too much, and you're definitely not going to get that with some very modern VSTs like Diva or Serum. So that would be it for this tutorial, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you learned something today. Make sure to check out our PML Academy. We've got a lot of start to finish courses for both beginners and more advanced producers. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, leave a like and comment, and I will see you in the next ones.